see, how many folks do we have at this point? And we're doing pretty well. Anytime you want, Mike, just to kick it off. Today we're going to go through Eclipse Foundation's smart city infrastructure. And Mike, let you take it away and sort of give us an overview, if you would.
Yeah, sure. So and by the way, please feel free to ask questions to go through here. My mission here is basically to explain sort of the portfolios of technologies that we have at Eclipse that we think are particularly relevant to smart cities, and start off with a bit of an introduction to what the Eclipse Foundation is all about itself, and then dive into some of our IoT stuff, then talk about Eclipse Keeple, which is all around urban transport, which I think is a big part of any kind of smart city solution. And with that, let me just dive into this. So the Eclipse Foundation, by the numbers, these are hard. This is one of those slides that's always hard to keep updated. We're over 380 projects now, still around 275 members, 1,550 committers, 195 million lines of code under our various projects. Using sort of industry standard metrics, that represents a value of somewhere in the $8 to $10 billion in terms of its asset value. And we do all of this with, I think we're up to 32 staff members now. So it's a pretty efficient organization. The four main things that we do at the Eclipse Foundation itself is governance and processes. So if you have people and companies coming together to work on open source code, and by far and away our main focus is in development of open source assets. More recently, we've started to get involved in specifications as well. So some people may have heard that Oracle announced a year and a half ago that Java EE was being moved to the Eclipse Foundation, and as a side effect of that announcement, we've had to create a specification process from the ground up. So we're starting to get into that business as well. It's in some ways, I guess, it's sort of a similar journey that Oasis is on, except coming at it from the other side. Then we do a lot of ecosystem development and marketing, so raising awareness of our projects, helping to get the message out that there's interesting technology here to be had. IP management and licensing. We feel that we set the high water mark in terms of IP management of open source projects, of all the foundations out there. For example, we're the only one that has full-time professional staff on board whose full-time job it is to scrub and scan and manage all of the software coming into our projects and the third-party dependencies to make sure that everything that we produce from the Eclipse Foundation is safe from commercial adoption, safe for commercial adoption. And then finally, infrastructure. We're probably at about 50% of our projects are now hosted on GitHub, but for the other 50%, we do manage our own Forge and using Git and Bugzilla and technologies like that. But then we also have for all of our projects, including many of the ones hosted on GitHub, we also host a very large and sophisticated build infrastructure. So being able to actually produce the software assets for all of our projects. The four main strategic focus areas that you'll see for that we have in Eclipse today are cloud native Java, IoT and edge, automotive, and tools. Now you'll notice that smart cities is not currently listed on that. The projects that I'm mostly going to be talking about today fall under the category of IoT and edge, but have a particular resonance with smart cities. And there's also some projects that we have that we would categorize as automotive that have a great deal to offer to smart cities as well. So in particular, we have a project called Eclipse Sumo, where Sumo is an acronym that stands for Simulation of Urban Mobility. And it's a very sophisticated simulation engine for being able to do sort of what-if analysis in modifying traffic flows, right down to pedestrian sidewalks, and all modes of public and private transportation. One other thing I just wanted to mention in passing is that we're also a bit of for any Europeans on the call, we're a bit of a rarity amongst open source foundations in that we have a European subsidiary, and we are directly engaged in a number of European research organizations, institutions, and projects. And so definitely, at least in the European context, funding, having a research project delivering its assets via open source communities is perceived as a positive thing, mostly because it helps ensure that the technologies are widely disseminated and are useful for commercial exploitation after the research project comes to an end. So that's another area that we're very involved in. All right, let's switch gears a little bit and start talking about some of the technologies that we have, and particularly around IoT and edge. We do feel, and I think we have the numbers to back us up on this, is that we are the open source center of gravity for the Internet of Things. So we have a very, very large and active community focusing on building technologies that are available for the Internet of Things. And so just some of the numbers in terms of what we provide here. So there's just under 4 million lines of code, 38 projects, 350 active contributors, and 43 member companies. But one of the things that I think is, just as an example, is of the velocity of this community is, if you look at our metrics on ongoing contribution to our projects in IoT, it's well over the average over the last 12 months is something around 1,200 commits a month. So this is definitely a very active and vibrant community building out these technologies. One area that's of particular interest, I think, is that in terms of IoT standards and specifications, you will find open source implementations of a great many of the technologies that people talk about in the IoT context. And so a couple of them that are particularly relevant, I think, in smart city application domains are things like MQTT, CoAP, lightweight M2M, and perhaps to a lesser degree DDS. But basically, these are fundamental protocols that are used by a lot of different devices out there to talk to components that are sensing and actuating in the real world. And again, as we talked through these meetings, a lot of these IoT technologies are definitely part of an overall smart city scenario. Then going through to the kind of overall ecosystem that's involved here. Companies like Bosch and Siemens are very actively engaged in both contributing and using these technologies. Software vendors that are making use of these technologies in their products and in their solutions offerings include Red Hat, Canonical, Cloudera, to name just a few. Then there's a number of IoT hardware manufacturers, including Intel, which are actively engaged in our community, and Intel is directly involved in a number of new projects in Eclipse IoT, specifically around device management. Sort of going further up the stack, telcos, Orange and Deutsche Telekom are involved. Then we also have IT services companies, and as we mentioned before, we're quite strong in the research community as well. And the technologies that we've got basically span all of what you see in a typical IoT architecture. So basically, you've got things out there, typically constrained devices with low memory. You've got then you've got gateways that are collecting data from multiple devices, perhaps supporting their maintenance in the field. And then you want to actually accumulate relevant data in the cloud and be able to act upon that data and provide that data to consumers perhaps through their mobile phones or the like, which would require access to the cloud infrastructure, but also to be able to more knowledgeably act upon that data. So just if you go through the three stacks, not going to go to any great detail in this context, but these are some of the projects that we've got which map into these various spaces. And one area that maybe should talk a little bit about is that's relevant in smart cities in particular is ontology. So being able to describe devices in a standard way so that you can build solutions that interoperate with multiple devices. So Eclipse Vorto, what that project does is builds out a repository of device descriptors and then a ecosystem of code generators, so that when you want to build a solution so that you're talking to, a particular piece of infrastructure like perhaps a traffic light or something like that, then you can have a description to make it easier to actually build out that solution. And these are sort of the companies that are contributing to all of these various pieces of technology. So on there you see a lot of Bosch, Red Hat, IBM, Intel, Eurotech, and so on. And then one project that I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking specifically on is Eclipse Keeple. This is a really interesting project in that this technology is what is currently used by 20% of the urban transport systems that are using contactless cards and mobile apps for urban transport. And I think this is definitely a big part of any kind of smart city scenario. So previously, this technology was managed by a group called the Eclipse Networks, and they still exist. They're definitely very involved. And Eclipse Networks was previously they had based their standard and their implementations on patent technology, and they decided, partially because the patent was coming close to its expiry date, to follow an open source strategy. So they've now open sourced the Java implementation of their ticketing infrastructure, and it's already starting to see quite a bit of uptake. So just a couple of examples of where this is already being deployed in real world systems is, so RATP, which is I'm sure many of you know is the organization that manages the urban transport system in the city of Paris in the region, is using this to build a remote fare collection service for retailers. Famoco, who does contactless ticketing kiosks based on Android, is using Keeple for its new generation of QR code-based mobile application ticketing systems. And then lastly, he's SNCF, which is the French railway system, is using Keeple to build out a ticketing system on Android devices. So this, whenever you talk about a relatively new open source project, it's always important to really highlight the fact that this is actually seeing real world and broad adoption through real organizations building out real systems. So just in closing, so we view the Eclipse Foundation primarily as an organization where our job is to be a platform for open innovation and collaboration. And some of the key values that we consider are important to us and our community is that we are driven by our community and by our members. We are very much an open source, so we're, as you may have gathered from the slides and the content of this presentation, we're very much about code first, about actually building pieces of software that can be used in real world systems, and particularly in commercial real world systems. And so commercial grade is really that our intent is that all of the projects that we have under our organization should be safe from both an IP licensing point of view, an IP management point of view, but of a quality where organizations and companies can feel confident in using them in their products or their solutions. And with that, I'll thank you for your attention and throw it open to questions.
Thanks, Mike. It's really helpful and a great sort of framing of this. Do you do you have any cities who have come to you and talked about what they're trying to do? Do you have an approach that you give to cities? I mean, I from a technical perspective, I'm sure you can, answer a lot of IoT questions, but at a sort of fundamental level of cities planning to take more of an open approach to developing city services and infrastructure. Have you had that kind of conversation with a city yet, and how do you approach it?
So the answer is no, not yet. But I'm in Paris meeting with there's a smart city thing going on there next week, and that's definitely going to be a big part of the conversation next week in Paris. So that will realistically be the first.
Yeah, Jacob had mentioned that, and I unfortunately I can't be there, but sounds like a really interesting meeting. We've talked a little bit about the IS City framework, and Saku was on a few weeks ago, sort of talking about the framing. There needs to be some sort of guidance for the cities that goes a little beyond the tooling and the infrastructure, and more towards helping them understand how to go about implementation. And so, that's really why I'm asking the question is, how do we get them over that hurdle, right? How do we?
Ultimately, a city CIO doesn't want what I just presented as a grab bag of technologies that you can assemble into a solution. They want a vendor or a system integrator who is going to provide them with that solution. And so I completely understand that dynamic, but that is the standard role that the Eclipse Foundation plays. I mean, we are a not-for-profit, and our goal is to provide real-world technologies that can be assembled into a solution or a product. That's our mission. There are some things that we deliver from the Eclipse Foundation that are, for all extents and purposes, a true product. The original Eclipse desktop IDE is probably the best example of that, where for almost 20 years now it's been delivered to the world as you download it, you use it every day as your desktop development tools. But we certainly have several other projects that reach that same level of fit and finish and convenience for the end user. In the IoT space, one of the specific things that's happening over the next, I would say, 6 to 8 months is if you go, so I'll go flip back. If you think back of these three stacks, is actually putting together some out-of-the-box solutions based on these projects. So, for example, if you are a commercial customer of Bosch's, what do they call it? IoT Cloud Suite, I think it's called. Basically, under the hood, you're using Hano, Hawkbit, Vorto, and Ditto. So there's, which is actually, it doesn't even appear in the slide. So so one of the things ideas is to build a open source stack out of those projects that you can download and basically get out of the box your cloud infrastructure for building out a solution. And then another stack that's going to be built out and be delivered as something that you can immediately download and use is Kura and Kapua, which are sort of Kapua is the cloud backend, and Kura is a very industrial strength device gateway framework that has been in service for many years in commercial applications. So trying to raise the convenience factor for people who want to build out solutions based on these technologies is definitely a goal for us over the next half a year or so.
That's great. You said they want a vendor solution. I agree. I think they need a community of vendors, right? One of the worries that I think cities have with some of the vendor solutions that are out there, even when they're open, like Bluemix and Predix, is that they are so tightly associated with a single vendor that it would be very hard if you built out a city using Bluemix to then bring in other vendors to manage that at some point. So I think this idea of sort of a community of vendors, preferably a broadly distributed community. Do you work with frameworks like like Django? How do you sort of see those in relation to what you do? In this kind of space.
Actually, to be honest, I apologize. I'm not that familiar with Django. So is that you mean? I remember a product like a content management system of.
Yeah, it's so yeah. It's probably I understand that it's an orthogonal thought, but the idea that there are a set of the key, I think, for the city perspective is interoperability, right? They want to know that if they buy a parking solution, that it works with the transit solution that they've already got in place. And so when you work with a content management system on a website, which is exactly what Django is, there's a very structured framework for how you build the various components of that website so as they interoperate. And I brought it up because I was wondering if there was an equivalent in sort of the IoT space that gave you a framework that if you follow that framework, much like the IES City framework that Sakru talked about, that allow you to say, this is not just the methodology and the tools, but this is the framework that you use if you want your elements to be interoperable, and if you follow this set of rules, then when you build a solution for your electric scooter or your car share, that they all work through the same framework.
Sure, I think I don't think there's a solution for complete out-of-the-box interoperability in these scenarios. I think the integration points in most modern applications is RESTful APIs provided by a collection of microservices. Yeah. And so in that vein, I can say that projects like Hano, Hawkpit, Ditto, and Vorto provide those a set of RESTful APIs that can be used in conjunction with other technologies, regardless of whatever language they're implemented in. And that's one of the key stacks that we're going to be building out over the next 6 months or so. So I think that would be an example of a starting point that would give you a set of services for your cloud backend that would be interoperable with other microservices-based applications and frameworks.
Great. Other questions?
I have just a really quick one. So you described a really broad, comprehensive structure that you have. How long has your foundation been in operation?
Oh, we're actually one of the old. Probably should have mentioned that. I think we're actually the oldest of the sort of member-supported foundations. So as a foundation, we're 15 years old. We were created in 2004. And the Eclipse IoT community specifically is now 8 years old since the first couple of projects that were contributed. So longevity and sustainability, I think, is something that we can safely say that we've demonstrated. 15 years in the software world is actually a really, really long time. Most of our original members no longer exist.
Right. Thank you very much. So would something like Mozilla be parallel to you
Yeah.
in some way?
Yeah. So Mozilla and Apache were a couple of years ahead of us. I think Apache just celebrated their 20th, so they're about 5 years older than we are. Mozilla's around the same frame. I think we're actually, well, depending on when you want to start counting, we're either a couple of years older than the Linux Foundation or 1 year younger. If before the Linux Foundation was created, it had a precursor called the Open Systems Development Laboratory, OSDL, and I think we were 1 year after them. So they were all. You can think of us as being in that sort of category of well-established open source foundations and communities.
And just one other question. So how do academics, university faculty tend to interact with you if they do?
There's several different ways. One is, particularly in Europe, they participate through, the way Europe does research funding is you always have to put together a consortium, and that consortium pretty much always has to exist of one or two large companies, a collection of small and medium-sized companies, and a collection of universities and or research institutions. And so in those contexts, we deal directly with a number of researchers and their graduate students in terms of them actually, building out software for under these research programs. Then we've also had, over our history, a number of times where projects have been spun out from university research labs into open source, and actually had been in the creation of a startup company around the technology. So that's another channel. And then a third channel is, we see this mostly in our modeling community because there's a very active academic culture around modeling where they're looking for technologies that they can demonstrate real world usage scenarios. So there's some situations where professors and research team leaders become directly involved in our projects as contributors and committers, and help move the technology forward just like any other open source community participant.
So have you been on any NSF proposals?
Actually, yes. In the past, we have. Interestingly enough, they weren't the biggest one of the bunch was not actually sort of about software development per se. It was about academic study of sort of the economics and social cultural aspects of open source development and how it was influencing the software and technology industry as a whole. So that's, we've been involved in that kind of research. There was one NSF funding scenario that we were supporting of, but we didn't actually get any direct funding. It was related to some work that was being done in the quantum computing space through Oak Ridge National Laboratory. And I should mention that we actually have like Oak Ridge and Pacific Northwest are members of the Eclipse Foundation and are directly supporting and championing a number of open source projects at the Eclipse Foundation. Voltron from Pacific Northwest is actually, in retrospect, is probably one I could have included in here because it's about smart grid and managing large-scale management of utilities.
That's great. Maybe Wilf and I could follow up with you at some point. We're connected with PMNL on some of their big projects, or trying to, and also University of Washington's computer science folks. So maybe there's a match there somewhere.
That would be cool.
How do you handle the other direction with universities? Or maybe a more general question. Um, how do you make sure that you have a community of people who are well trained to be able to do this? I mean, do you encourage universities to use your tools and train your methods? Do you help put together curricula for educational institutions? Do you run your own classes? How do you handle, sort of making sure that there's a vibrant community of people who understand the methodologies, or do you leave that up to your member companies?
We mostly leave it up to our member companies and the community at large. As I'm sure you're aware, a lot of academics lean towards an interest in free software. So I would say that in the academic setting, there's a lot of use of the Eclipse IDE, for example. And for folks that do modeling, there's, very few people, would graduate for the master's degree in systems modeling without being exposed to Eclipse-based tools. So a lot of it happens organically. IBM in particular, early in our history, invested a lot in funding both researchers and curriculum development, but it's been quite a few years since they actively did that. We do rely historically on our members, but it hasn't. It's been a while since we've seen one of our members invest in it heavily.
Hopeful. How do you see yourself? I mean, there are a number of groups moving towards particularly the IoT, but also the smart city space. And I know a couple of them are going to be with you in Paris, right? So Fireware and Linux Foundation are sort of both moving in this direction. How do you see your interaction with them? Are there clear roles, or do you see yourselves as collaborative? How do you engage with other groups that have software projects in the IoT space?
So with the Linux Foundation, Linux Foundation and Eclipse Foundation are actually we've done a membership swap. We're in constant and close contact with those folks, and although I would say that with the Linux Foundation, their urban computing project, which I think is the one that you're referencing, is actually fairly narrow in focus. I wouldn't say that they've actually have something that's that sort of really spans the whole gamut of the technologies you need for smart cities. Maybe they've got an initiative that they haven't announced yet that I don't know about. But I think that in general, the answer is co-opetition, right? We compete for projects and members, but we inevitably end up using each other's technologies. So if you look into any number of Linux Foundation projects, whether they're in the networking space or whether they're in IoT, there's a lot of them that end up using projects out of Eclipse IoT. And, as another example, there's hardly a project at Eclipse that doesn't use something from Apache. So there's just a lot of, we're all using pretty compatible licenses, and so there's just a lot of cross adoption between these various communities.
Yeah, I was glad to see your new license. It's a big license. Is there another question there? I had a question about, you didn't quite answer the Fireware question, because they have the additional advantage of also being international. So they may be an interesting partner here. Have you had discussions with them? Do you know what they're doing, and are you interested in a tighter link there with what they've been doing?
We're always interested in collaboration. I mean, that's what we do.
Right.
So, but to be honest, it's probably been 5 years since I've taken a serious look at Fireware and what technologies they have. So I would have to invest some time to kind of understand the current state of play in their in what they're offering.
Right. And they're part of the reason we're interested in them. We've known them for a while. They've been part of the Global City Teams Challenge from fairly early on. And so we have a good link, and the funding that funded them also funded a number of interesting startup companies in Europe. So potential good hunting ground for additional projects might be. That was good. Other questions from folks? Well, Mike, that was really helpful. If nobody else has any question, let's draw it to a close. But this was extremely helpful. I did record it, so if people missed the beginning of it, you can go to the site and watch it from there. It'll probably be later today before it's actually up there. It takes a little bit of processing time, but thank you very much. Any last